Ani Bujo, Myeengun Henry, Deshkan Zibi and Donjaba, Myeengun Donem. I'd like to welcome everybody back to this week's version of Nish Vibes. We've been going along pretty good for the last few weeks, and we have a number of interviews that we've been able to work with various people of the university, and now we're getting ready to prepare them and to go live with them. So it's been a really fun opportunity to meet various people at the university and to learn about this big university that has so many wonderful people here. There's people in all capacities that bring their experience and expertise to the university, and they walk through various capacities of the university as a teacher or as a staff person or people even in the governance area. So this is what I guess it's a celebration of ourselves, the Indigenous people in this community, and how we're going to see our future together. So today we are pleased to announce that we have Evan Vandermeer, who will be our guest for today. And we hope that, we get a good conversation going. As you know, our conversations are never scripted. We just go with the flow and however the conversation turns. Anyway, Evan, thank you for joining us today. Appreciate you taking the time. Thanks for coming over to visit us at the Faculty of Health.
Sego Myeengun. It's I'm honestly really thrilled to be joining you here today. You're one of the first faces I got to know here on campus last fall. And, our paths, I kind of feel they've crossed. Our paths have crossed every once in a while on campus. And also, you being from Chippewa, the Thames, past chief, and now, me growing up on Oneida, the Thames. And I think, one of my very first romantic partners I met, Rosie Sturgeon, a very nice Chippewa woman, definitely changed my life in a big way. And then it was so cool to hear years later that you made such a big impact and, changed her life and helped her get married years later. It's kind of, I realized you were someone special that I needed to keep close.
Thank you. And I remember when we had that conversation, and Rosie, when she wanted to do a traditional wedding, and she approached me, and this is what I do. I do traditional weddings and funerals. So I got a chance to know her and her husband. And when you brought her name up, and you got to know her quite a while ago, and that's good. That's how this world works. We have people in common. And I notice even, if I'm out in Vancouver or different places, I run into Indigenous people, there's always a relationship somewhere. I was on a Skyway train in Vancouver one time, and there was a native, and I just went over to say hello to him and started talking, and he was from my reserve. And he didn't live here, or he didn't travel here very much, but he was from my reserve. So it was kind of interesting how that happens. So today, like I said, our conversations have really no script to them. So maybe we can find out a little about you. You're from Oneida. Your reserve is really close to mine, right across the river, we call it. And tell me about your upbringing. Were you raised in this region or on the reserve, or?
Yeah, perfect. So I should probably clarify that, I was raised up there in Oneida, the Thames, but I'm actually Wahta Mohawk, so Kanien'keha. And a lot of my family, we came originally from Ganesatage, traveled with the original family group that settled up in Wahta. And then, just through happenstance, my great-grandmother, Ida Rennie, she ended up attending Mount Elgin Industrial School, just on Oneida, the Thames there. And years later, I found me and my family growing up there about a kilometer just off of the reserve, and not even aware of that history, not even aware that my great-grandmother had spent time there. And, I was very grateful. There wasn't a lot of economic opportunity, and, I'd work for farmers and tired of getting ripped off, working 13 hours days. And I was very lucky. There was a shop there, Ambrose, owned by Arliss and Ray Christian. Rest in peace, Ray. And, they were lucky to give me a job, and I got in there. I was washing dishes, and it was all you can eat buffet. Every Saturday, Sunday, I had to wash dishes, and we didn't have no dishwasher. So I was the dishwasher. So
Okay.
3-sink method, just in there washing as fast as I could. But as soon as I was done washing, I would go into the dining room and I would write. And I'd spend time talking with the staff and just writing things. And the owners were very understanding, and they really invested in their team and saw that we were growing and gave us that time to do that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And, I scraped a few nickels together, and I moved to Waterloo when I was 18. And I got my first restaurant job, and I went and I washed dishes. And
Why did you choose Waterloo? Was it
It's such a funny thing. I think somebody donated a University of Waterloo shirt to the bargain bin at the Value Village. And I liked the color. I liked the way the shirt looked. And I wore it a lot in grade 10. And I had a couple, like my grandmother, she lived up here. So I came once when I was 15 and I got lost in the city on my bike. And I must have biked around for 3-4 hours in the hot sun. And I don't know. And there was just something about it that when I kind of grew up, I decided this is going to be my forever home. And I very quickly found the Grand River, and it reminded me a lot of the Thames.
Okay.
And I knew that that's just being around that river was something special. And even when I was a young lad, there was something that pulled me to there.
Yeah, it's funny how that works sometimes, like where you end up being sometimes is where things happen for you. And, I think you found a life here, and the school here, was available for you. And I guess that's the route you took. So you came to the university, and what did you take over here? What was your...
Yeah, I started my degree. I worked for about 10 years, and I started my degree in biology here at the University of Waterloo. I was a science student, and I was very interested in the immune system. I had a partner of mine, her name was Sarah Oreyu, very special person, great sense of humor, beautiful woman. And I lost her to autoimmune disease, a kidney dysfunction related to lupus. And so a lot of this, this is a big why that pulled me in. I wanted to understand what happened, and I wanted a deeper insight into the immune system and what was happening. And my sister got diagnosed with an autoimmune as well. And so that really cemented my decision to come here and study biology.
Wow. So do you ever think about like medical area or just biology mostly, or going into healing, that type of thing, now that you learn about it?
Yeah, interesting. My studies into immunology really quickly brought me into studying the mushrooms, which is a big focus of my research now. My sister, during the pandemic, she was being treated with immunoglobulin, but during the pandemic, there was a massive shortage of blood plasma, which is a cause she takes on, Plasma for All. Yeah, it's absolutely, please donate. But,
okay. Good tip for everybody.
Yeah. But when she wasn't able to get that medicine, we started giving her. So basically her condition, her immune system attacks her motor nerves. And so she was losing control of her fingers and toes. And we started her on a mushroom called lion's mane. And this mushroom actually stimulates nerve growth factors in mammals. And so she made a pretty quick recovery, which we were kind of shocked by. But it wasn't until she got back to the doctor and she noticed that her nerves had actually started to heal and improve. And that's when I really doubled down and I started really paying attention to these mushrooms, started pitching to organizations like Velocity and Greenhouse, and received some seed funding to get my venture started in the mushrooms.
Yeah, I remember first time we met, I think we had a conversation about mushrooms. It was over by the fire. And I realized how interested you are in them now. Now I know why. You found something that related to healing of people and people special to you. So that's good that we draw to it. And with your Indigenous heritage, I think it kind of, I work in traditional medicine too. And when it comes to our natural medicines, these are things that we've had in our, capacity for years because we didn't have access to Western medicine. And so traditional healers knew about mushrooms and plants and trees and parts of creation that can be what medicine probably should be. When it comes to pharmaceutical medicine, I think they seem to be copying what is in natural medicines anyway. So I don't know if you've kind of compared that, with your research on mushrooms and the work that you've done with it. Do you see any relationship to like what the mushrooms can do medicinally compared to like what pharmaceutical medicines? Ever get a chance to look that deep into it?
Yeah, I think there's a big misunderstanding of where our medicine does come from. And I think it just comes from, we don't know a lot about the fungi. People don't know that yeast is a fungi. People don't know that mold is a fungi. Some folks don't know that coral in the ocean is a fungi. And, let's look at mold, for example. Penicillin, a completely game-changing revolution in pharmaceuticals, has changed our ability to fight disease in a way that was unpredictable 100 years ago. And it came from mold. It came from fungi. This was a mold that was producing these molecules to help steward the community, the microbiome community, the way, we might steward a forest and make sure that the right plants are growing. The fungi are stewarding this micro ecosystem, and they've created all of these tools to work with these microbes to make sure they're feeding the ones it wants to support, and maybe stopping others from spreading and disrupting its life cycle. So I think we can learn a lot from them. And I think pharmaceutical companies are very aware of how powerful these fungi are. And so it's not something that's taught. It's not something that's taught in school. And there's a big disconnect that I'm hoping to break.
What I found very interesting, and in our last conversation we had, was about the rain and how the Southwestern Native people, learned how to use the spores. Can you talk about that a little bit?
I would love to. Yeah, 100%. So the largest organism on the planet is a fungi. It's a honey mushroom that's in the Northwest United States. It spans for hectares and hectares. And this fungi, a high surface area, it's collecting information about its entire ecosystem. But one of the cool things is when it gets thirsty, it will produce a massive amount of these honey mushrooms, which are delicious, by the way. And it'll release millions upon millions of spores. And those spores are actually, they use the same force that makes the lightning, that static between the clouds and the earth. It uses that force to pull those spores up into the atmosphere. And each of those spores is a condensation point that acts, and all the water is drawn to those spores. And once it reaches a certain density, the rain begins to fall. And so that mushroom is doing sophisticated geoengineering, making rain when it needs water, and doing a very serious ecosystem service. Now, it wasn't until I was listening to an Anishinaabe speaker, and they're talking about the thunder dance, and they were talking about the meaning behind the words. And the literal translation is the kicking up of dust. And I started to put it together as, these knowledge keepers, they understood, the way the mushrooms understood. The atmosphere was holding moisture, and they knew if they went to these sites that had a special kind of dust, and they got everyone together, and in unison with the beat of that drum, they kicked that dust up into the air. And with a big fire lit, that fire would cause convective lifting, and it would lift that dust into the upper atmosphere. And just like those mushroom spores would cause the water to collect, and it would fall back down to the ground, and giving the people rain and the soil with the nourishment that it desperately needed. And so, this kind of knowledge, not everyone probably in the community understood, and, they might not even understood exactly how it worked, but from thousands upon thousands of years of people needing to survive, just these rituals come about. And this is deep knowledge, sophisticated geoengineering that I think the archaeological record is just beginning to validate. And so giving that kudos to the Indigenous folks for understanding this medicine, understanding our climate and our weather systems in such a beautiful way.
That just so impressive, because they've kind of lumped our dances into like show, right? And just a matter of the Wild Bill shows, back in the day when they wanted to see Native people dance, it was entertainment. But the science part of that, and when I think about our traditional medicines, when we're dealing with cancers and diabetes, it's not that we go and pull plants and say, this is what you need. We had our own scientific research, for many generations. They've learned the combination of medicines and how they interact with the body, and they can stimulate healing cells. And I think this is what kind of gets not seen enough. It's not show, and it's not just entertainment. It's serious scientific research that Indigenous people hold. Those knowledge keepers were, the way that they taught it and used this knowledge wasn't academic like we do today. It was passed on to future generations, or we had societies, who had special gifts that they could work with medicines, and then they would be entered into this society and they learned the different methods. So I find that really, really amazing. The more I learn about it, the better.
I'm incredibly grateful to be studying science at the University of Waterloo today. Being able to include some of the Indigenous teachings just into the methodology of science is so valuable. And the fact that it's not discouraged outwardly. I come back from a chefing background, washing dishes, working in kitchens. But when I first saw Haudenosaunee cooking techniques, I really began to appreciate the level of food science that was going on there. And you realize the food is alive. Mm-hmm. And that's the big difference. That food, there are small living things in that food making it prepared. The digestion has already begun before it's even touched your lips. And it's so different from our modern diet where everything is preserved and designed to, we don't want anything living on our food, And I think this is a big cause of this, the shift toward modern disease. The mushrooms, a lot of people think, oh, the mushrooms are fixing this, they're fixing that. But the truth is that they're fixing our gut, because there's living things in those mushrooms that the gut microbes want, and it really helps them thrive and keeps that gut healthy. And when the gut isn't healthy, when you have the wrong things living there, they'll start to eat you. And when they start to eat you, they tear tiny little holes in your gut. And those tiny holes, that lets the outside world into your inside world. And your immune system has to defend itself. Yeah.
When I think about that, sometimes the cravings that you have for food, a lot of it has been induced by, modern food, sugary foods and stuff like that. But I think our elders used to say, when we crave certain foods, especially certain times of year, that's when we built our immune system up. And what we do is we create these tonics, that we create during the 4 seasons that we have, and your immune system gets built up. But you begin craving those types of things that time of year because your body starts to remember, that this is what I need in my system. So that's why I'm curious to know, like, working in science, how receptive they are to this type of knowledge. My wall that I run into all the time is if they haven't studied it to the lowest common denominator, they don't look at it the way that we do in more of a spiritual kind of a content, right? And I think not everything needs to be totally studied to the point. I think there's got to be some faith there that it works, that Creator put these here for some reason. What do you think about that?
I think you bring up one of the coolest things that's happening with science right now is that our measuring sticks have gotten so good, Myeengun. Our ability to measure things, we're kind of at our limit of what we can measure right now. But there are some things like the brain, there's some things like the immune system, there are some things like the development of a child inside its mother, that it doesn't matter. You can take all the measurements and empirical data you like. There are some things about that we just don't understand. And I think empirical Western science is starting to wake up to that fact, that there are just some mysteries we'll never be able to unravel. And I think that humility, that's where the beauty between traditional understanding and this empirical measurement attitude can kind of merge back into each other, is we're realizing that, there's some things we just have to trust, like your immune system, There's some things you just can't, a pharmaceutical company can't quite dial in, and you just have to be eating the right food and trust your immune system to take care of itself.
Totally agree with that. I was speaking to a scientist yesterday and they said, we like problems. If everything works perfectly, we don't have a job. So we go out and try to find, and I don't have no problem with people exploring, these things, but the limit of that needs to be someplace there's as Indigenous people would say, the spiritualness of life, the natural law that we have, and sometimes we don't need to know those answers, we just allow it to exist and do its thing. So that's where I find the wall, where I'm glad you're saying that they're starting to open up now to, these kind of concepts and ideas a little bit. But overall, we've been able to advance knowledge because we keep bringing these back up. These knowledge keepers and medicine people, they don't give up. This is what they do, and what they're trying to do is help people to maintain our natural ecology. With why we protect the water, why we consider it to be sacred, why we need to work together to keep the earth healthy. I think that's the role that we play as Indigenous people, to make sure these medicines stay sacred. That helps people along the way. That's what I think anyway, but I really like your enthusiasm with this, like it's something that more Indigenous people, I think, really need to start looking at it from this way. We've gone through the hardship of residential schools and the poverty that, exists on First Nations. And I mean, that's a reality. But when you find something that you're drawn to and you run with it, like the way you're doing it, I think that's really a good inspiration for young people. So I appreciate, you being this enthusiastic about this. Did you know you had that? Like, is it something that you felt when you are enthusiastic about mushrooms or this role you're on? Do you realize people are seeing that?
I mean, you hope that people are kind of appreciating it. And I think you bring up a good point earlier is I've had plenty of resistance along the way. Plenty of people who disagreed with me, told me my ideas didn't make sense, and were very academically rigorous at criticizing my ideas. And I thank every single one of those people, because the truth is that's what made my ideas better. That's what made my ideas so strong. And that's what makes them, I can walk into any academic environment and I can have my ideas understood and heard. And so that's a valuable thing, is being able to engage with the community and making my ideas and my passion and enthusiasm stronger. And so thank you. I thank them for that. And so I think Indigenous folks, if you have an idea, especially if you're pursuing something with traditional knowledge, and if people don't understand, keep going, especially if that knowledge, you know that it's been validated and it's been validated across generations and it's something you know deeply. Keep pushing and keep challenging folks, because they'll get you to look at it in a new way, but also you'll get them to look at it in a new way. And guess what? Science and traditional knowledge, all that happens is Western science is just catching up to the traditional knowledge, and it's just validating what Indigenous folks have been saying for hundreds of years. So just keep speaking your truth, and eventually Western science will catch up and validate it. And just having that trust, stick by your principles, but also, you can change them every day.
That's so true, because I work with the medical students at McMaster, and I work with first year students, and I bring in, the idea of traditional medicine, and they're so open to it. Young minds that just want to know about ways of healing, especially medical students. Then one year they put me in with third years, and by then they were already, well, that's not really tested, but we know this is. And there was a big, maybe the educational component to it, has to evolve a little bit too. The science is there, and we'll find that. But I think the way that we present these to students to keep their mind open and engage with the First Nation communities, that still do this work. Because I think I met with, various, David Suzuki, for one, when I sat with him, he talks about evolution and how things came to be here, but he kept that part in his mind open to say that, well, maybe Indigenous people were put on this land, to protect it, and their responsibilities to it is so strong that they still do that. So I think even a scientist that with that much experience can see a different world if they venture into our world a little bit more. So I was pretty happy when he said that. We'll try to get more thinking that way.
Yeah. I think that's kind of what I see when I see the two-row now. That idea is, Western folks, in order to get to peace, they have to understand that their ideas are not better. It's not a hierarchy of ideas, and that this knowledge is better than this knowledge, and that there's this scale. And then from the Indigenous perspective, moving toward peace means understanding that incorporating Western knowledge into our value structure isn't a complete disgrace, isn't a complete abandonment of traditional values, either in the traditional ways of knowing. And I'm very, very grateful that my early career and my career now and my community that's been supporting me my whole life has firmly planted me with two-eyed seeing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is the road to peace, is seeing that we need the traditional knowledge because losing it, the cost is too great. And we need the Western knowledge because it too has value and it can make our lives easier. And we do need to do everything in our power to make our lives easier so that we can care for one another. And life is hard. And comfort and making things easier and solving problems is a good thing. But understanding that we can't always have it easy, and it won't always be as easy as it is right now. And a little bit of traditional knowledge can go a long way in making sure that we have young people who can pass that knowledge on to their kids, and we continuously have that in this world is the most important thing for the long-term sustainability of this planet.
The philosophy that I use on that is Western medicine is great too. It's brought out, some magnificent changes in health among people. But when you side that with our own traditional medicine, then you get the best of two worlds. And we still have problems sometimes when somebody goes to the doctor and they say, well, don't take those herbs right now because it'll interfere with our medicine right now. I kind of say, if you get a foundation of our natural medicines, which grow in the region that we arrive from, it creates your immune system and builds your body up so that their actually medicine works better. It paves the way for them to work better. So when I said that to doctors, they really opened their eyes up and said, that sounds good and probably true. Because if you're from Asia or if you're from Africa or Europe, medicines that grow in that region naturally are sometimes the medicines we need in our body. So here in North America, there's certain medicines that grow in this region that when we put those into our body starts stimulating, itself to create better cells and to grow better. And their medicine just works much better.
Right. Your genes are set up in these, they call them TADs, these topologically associated domains. But it's basically what makes a cell unique from the other cells is the way their chromosomes are displayed. And that affects how your genes are being transcribed and produced in your body. There's a community in the Philippines if they are eating a lot of deep water shellfish, their body will just naturally, their ability to hold their breath underwater will increase substantially just from making this change in their diet, because of a time in history when folks had to dive to get their food, and they did that every day. And it's pretty amazing to think that just something as simple as changing your diet could have such a massive genetic and physiological response. And there's different parts of our being just awaiting, and our genetics and food. We talk a lot when we talk about how Indigenous folks were affected. There's a lot of terrible things that I think take precedent, especially, the children, the women and the men in prison, and, having their economic vitality taken away. But the big thing for me is the food. Being taken away from your food and being disconnected from that food culture, there's no call to action for that. I think it's a massive missing piece and a big reason why Indigenous folks can't get healthy on this new diet. And it's because their body are calling out for something specific and that medicine that grows in the ground in the right way.
Well, even organic food, has been contaminated quite a bit by the environment. So when we have, that type of food in our system, like our fish, take the Thames River. We lived on pickerel, every year. And it was something that we needed in our bodies and still do. But you can't eat much anymore because of the runoff of the urban settings and poison that's in the river now. So we've been limited to even our own, food intake based on environmental ill practices, that take place today. So that's why I think, we really need to push this a little bit more. But, because of your credential now, as a university student, and a lot of times people won't listen to us unless we have those credentials under our name. I know Indigenous people have tried to speak, but there's a person with the credential over there with the MD or with the PhD, they'll listen to them first. And I think that's the beauty of what you're doing. You're that two-eyed seeing, you can walk into that world and they'll listen to you now, where before, they'll listen to you, but not really take what you're saying properly. So we need to get more students in that world to build the changes that's necessary, I think. So I don't know. That's what I see in my life right now. I don't have those credentials, and I really feel that at some point it would have been more beneficial for me to find that, but I would have missed out on what I've learned in the process. So there was a balance there. But now I can give advice and say, this next generation, if you have the ability and we're getting more knowledge keepers to help teach, then you can get both worlds and really have a big change in society. So that's my hope anyway. We'll see.
I used to, before I came back to school, I was a professional. I was working in kitchens, spent my 20s, really working sometimes 4 jobs at a time just to make ends meet. I didn't come to university until, like I said, I was 25. And I did really have that attitude that I was less than because I didn't have the education. I definitely treated myself in a different way because of that. Thought that was, that's for them and that's not for someone like me. But when I stepped into the stream, I guess, and with my paddle, I realized that, life number one had prepared me. You go through your 20s, whether you do it at a university, whether you do it in a First Nations community, whether you do it working, a remote job out in the oil sands of Alberta, I think you do grow. You do grow, and you grow in different ways, and you become what you practice. I spent my years communicating online, taking raw ingredients and turning them into elevated dining experiences and making people laugh, doing comedy on stage and, doing a few sales jobs. And that's translated into the success later in life and why I'm able to do this. So I think no matter where you are in your journey, even you, Myeengun, I think never too late to get any of those credentials. Mm-hmm. But I think nowadays, especially, they don't make or break you. And I think the world is starting to just realize that people are people and we all have value.
I think, how our Indigenous people thought about elders, the experience that they have, it's so valuable, to go through life, experiment things, fail and succeed and, grow. And that's why you come to that age where you become so valuable for the next generation, because they can help you through or see something that you're doing to guide you on a path. Because today, we have high addiction problems in our First Nation, poverty, on our First Nations. And there's an anger in this generation, because I think they've now come to realize what colonization did and how come our parents and grandparents were addicted or died young. And I think we're going through this evolution now of realizing what happened. So your first reaction to that is a lot of times anger. now that I know what happened, I'm angry and I'm mad at all these, non-native people for doing this. I think we have to go through this period, as a generation. But I think once we get through, and just like any time you are at odds with somebody, it takes a time of reflection with yourself and a conversation with those that you oppose to get through it. So I think maybe that's where we are in society today. I think we got a little work to do because reconciliation is something we're striving for, but the truth, as they talk about, is hurtful. And I think that's why we're acting this way now. We're feeling this way, and we'll find our path. But I think we'll be beneficial down the road. So, do you kind of get that feeling about this generation, your generation? If you can kind of think of like the older generation before you, maybe the people who inspired you, and then you come into the world. How do you take that knowledge, and what do you think for the future?
Yeah, I'm going to lean on my one of my great uncles, Chief Joseph Oneida Aganesatage. He was one of the first Kanien'keha men to learn to speak and read English and French. He was studied at College of Montreal with Louis Riel. He met with the first Minister of Indigenous Affairs, and he was working in the seminary with the Sulpicians. Now, the Sulpicians had been given kind of custody of the pines, which was our sacred forest and the land that we had been living on for quite a while, and that they legally held the title. And when my ancestor learned to read and write, one of the first things, he was going through the records, transcribing them, and he realized that the Sulpicians were selling the land. And so he was in this unique position where, all of a sudden he could see, he had two eyes wide open, and he was one of the only people in his community. And when he brought it back to the elders, everyone was obviously very upset and didn't really understand what was happening and why he was upset. But he insisted. And so he went to the Minister of Indigenous Affairs. He chopped down an elm in defiance when they told him that the Ganesatage people could not chop wood in that forest. And this act of defiance, eventually he moved with the family group to Wahta, where my home community is now. And many in his community didn't agree with the way he handled it. Many people were mad at him. The Sulpicians were mad at him. And he ended up getting excommunicated from basically both of his community, the Western and the First Nations community. And, he went to a banquet with the Sulpicians one day and he got violently ill and passed away a few days later. And so I think a lot about him. I think a lot about Chief Joseph and what he must have gone through and what it was like to have both eyes wide open and see the injustice. And he was perfectly justified in his anger. And I think the young folks today, we now have the internet. And when you come to university, a lot of what you learn about at university is waking up to the reality of what happened to the ancestors. And I think it's perfectly justified. This is an emotion that people need to be able to feel. And telling young folks to not be angry isn't really helpful because they have to experience that. And part of getting educated and looking at the papers and seeing what was done, that's a personal transformation. And if you don't express that anger, it's going to boil under the surface. And this is why people are lashing out, killing themselves with the drugs or the booze and killing each other for whatever reason, because that anger has to get put somewhere. And usually it's on the people closest to us.
You totally got that right. When I was chief of my nation, I seen it all the time. And, you just want to help them, but you got to go through that anger, but hopefully you do it in a better way. We're not hurting yourself or others. And a lot of times that's the only thing they have left. And we're still going through that. And I think it's a big part of our healing process to come back to our culture and learn the things that we talked about, our emotions, which they took away from residential school students. Absolutely. They couldn't show their emotion and their love for their families that way. Got really bottled up with that inside of them. And really, that's a main cause, I think, of a lot of the destruction that took place in our communities. So I really appreciate you saying that, because having an inspiration like the chief that you talked about, giving you some inspiration to do what he did. He was ousted from his own community and still lived up to his values that he knew, would be beneficial. So if you take that as inspiration for yourself now, how would you pass it on to future generations? Do you just keep those stories alive and tell them, or are you trying to expose more about what your history was about to young generation coming up?
Yeah, I would tell them to look, like Chief Joseph did. That's the painful process. Is we all want to close the book and look away, but having the strength to keep reading, because there might be information in there that might help the Indigenous children in the future. For example, I did a job as an Indigenous file reviewer for Family and Child Services. And I quit that job a lot earlier than I probably should have because it was painful. It was painful just to read what was happening to these kids. And I wasn't strong enough to look. I didn't have the community healing. I hadn't sweat yet. I was still hurting, and it was too much for me to take on. And I think that, forgiving myself and understanding that, hey, you can only take on so much at a certain time, and you have a lifetime. You have a lifetime to pass on these teachings. You don't have to do it all in a day, and taking breaks from reconciliation work is to heal yourself and purge those whatever has gotten in you, smudging, whatever you need to do to clean that off. And that's what the medicines are for. And I think the reason we offer the tobacco is it wasn't until I offered that tobacco, I think, at the fire that I was able to let go of some of those stories that I read of those children and was able to pass that message on to Creator and to feel like, because I didn't feel like I was helping anyone when I was working there, but just passing on that smoke to Creator, that felt more like I was sending that message and that it was going to be heard and maybe something good was going to happen.
Wow. Mm-hmm. And that is so important to say because people don't look at these fires that we have as sacred, they're just optics, and they mean so much to the person that has to talk to Creator, and if our tobacco is meant for that purpose, then maybe Creator will be kind enough to relieve you of those, hurts that we feel. I've been working with the hospitals here and we're talking about putting in a permanent fireplace and what happened last year was my father-in-law, who was a survivor from the Mohawk Institute in Brantford, was really injured there and went through life. He had a complexion that people wouldn't know he's native, so he was able to, they called him lucky if you didn't look native and you can travel through society, right? So he was able to pass for non-native, but he was both native as both parents were. And so he came to Kitchener, and after being angry about the abuse he took at school, he wanted to get at all the white people. He said, I'm going to beat them somehow. I'm not big enough to beat them physically, but I'm going to beat them intellectually. And he became probably the first principal ever in this region, Indigenous principal. So being a teacher wasn't good enough. He had to be one up on them. So he had a very competitive nature. And if you played him golf, especially if you're non-native, he's going to beat you, and that's how we beat everybody. He didn't beat him up, but he beat him in another way. And so when he was on his final days, he was at the Grand River Hospital, and we just happened to, I've been working with them. So I said, we're going to have a fire and I'll let you know what that fire is about. So we had the administrators come out, and we didn't know Jim was going to be in the hospital at that time, but we kept the day going. And so we had the fire outside, and we had the fire. The administrators came, and my wife and her sisters came out because they said, I need to give Creator a message, that we know my dad's going to leave, but I just want him to be in no pain or nothing. And so he was they took him off everything for 5 days and he was still going. And so they put tobacco in the fire. I think it was about an hour. He passed away. I think it was their prayers to Creator that helped him relieve himself to leave this world. And the administrators seen that. And they were just like, wow, now I understand what that fire is for and what that tobacco is for and what, why we need to do this. So unfortunately, it takes real life incidents sometimes for people to understand. But I think, now that we've made that mark and we need to continue to show the need that Indigenous people have always understood about these sacred things like fires and tobacco and things like that. So I really hope that this is where we are going in society. With, like you said, the two-row wampum was always meant for us to live in equal balance and to have that distance, to keep our cultures prime. And, of course, everything changed, with resources that they wanted every bit of it, and they pushed us aside. Residential schools came in. So now that we're through this and moving forward as a nations of people, I think we can start changing this scenario and make it better for our future generations. So we got to open up, though. We got to tell their stories, and we got to get out of this, not so much like the anger we talked about, but the hurt from that anger that we pose on ourselves and saying that we're not good enough to come to university. That part, we have to get through that part. So that's my hope anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. Oneida is very isolating, not too far from London, but you wouldn't know it. It's a very different place, very different economic development, very different municipal services being offered. But There's a lot of value on that nation as far as, the wildlife is concerned, as far as, the forest is concerned. It's a very healthy place. And I think that wealth that exists in the nature, I think that can be a healing force for the community. I think that university is a cool place where First Nations folks and Western folks, we get opportunities to see each other's worlds. And I think that's what's important, is just getting a real good look at each other. And I think like the government has done everything in its power to not allow us to really look at each other, and they've tried to keep us separated and keep that divide. I remember the attitude, a lot of people wouldn't even come to my house growing up just because I was so close to Oneida, let alone go on Oneida. And I've seen that change. I've seen that change a lot in the last 15 years, where, now folks, they'll actually venture on to Six Nations. They'll venture on to the territory, but still not the same kind of, many have never been to a First Nation. Many have never seen it up close. That needs to change. And especially with so many people coming into Canada, that's a huge piece that's not being taught about Canadian citizenship, is these treaties, and saying when these folks come and settle in Canada, when they're not educated about the treaties, that's exactly how conflict started throughout history. Is we have treaties with the people who are here, and new folks come, they weren't taught or don't understand the treaties, and so it's not their fault that they act outside. And when Indigenous folks respond and say this is wrong, it historically just hasn't gone good for First Nations communities, and I'm hoping that can change.
Well, especially for international people coming here, because what they've seen of Indigenous people are from the movies and those types of things. And even some nations still call us Red Indians. They come here and they say, oh, you're a Red Indian. I say, what? No, I'm a little brown. I'm not red, but that's what they hear and that's what they understand it to be. So Canada and the United States, they really like to protect their reputation, right? So when I talk to international students today, they never heard about residential schools and what we've gone through in the broken treaties and wampum belts and that type of thing. That just doesn't get beyond this borderline. And Canada works really hard to make sure that it doesn't get out there, because they got this reputation of multicultural country, and we invite everybody. But when international students come here and they realize what happened, a lot of time it's similar to what they've gone through in their countries where colonization took place. And then they realize, wow, it happened here too. And they get really entrenched in our conversations because it hits home with them. And I think this is why knowledge is so important. And when we get those stigmas out of there and those stereotypes, why they wouldn't come on the First Nation, because there's no law there, there's no policing, there's drugs there, there's danger there. When I was chief, I was trying to create a reason to bring people, because you'll only develop economy when you have flow of money going through, and they come, and not just for cannabis or gas or anything like that, cigarettes, had to be legitimate kind of businesses. So I was trying to get us branded to things that were natural to us, like maple syrup, get people to start doing these type of businesses, getting people to come and circulate the money through our community. We did a leakage study, with our income on our reserve, and we found out that 90% of our income is spent off reserve. It doesn't revolve in the community. That's a reason why we can't create businesses, because it doesn't stabilize itself and they go out of business after a little while. So a lot of reasons. But I think now that we see this, we can actually make the changes. But it has to, like I said, we have to get through this period now. And people are still angry, and that's understandable. But once we come to terms with what we can do in this world, then I think we can use that anger to become better people for it. And then educate people outside too. So that's kind of the hope. We'll see if it happens.
It's funny you bring this up. This is exactly what we're trying to address with our new incubator, Flint Hub, the Indigenous diploma program offered by the University of Waterloo. Is, we have these language programs, right? And the goal of these language programs is to create Indigenous language speakers. And so now we've developed this program. It's built with case studies of all Indigenous businesses. These are businesses that are relevant. They're on LinkedIn. You can find and talk to these business owners. But the key thing is that when Indigenous folks are studying business, or when they come to the university and they go to a Velocity, right? A lot of these attitudes are they're trying to build these big billionaire global companies. But for Indigenous communities, it doesn't necessarily need to be. It just needs to be, like you say, it can be land-based learning. It can be maple syrup. It can be these legitimate businesses and giving Indigenous folks access to the credit, the grants, and the expertise so that they can make these businesses happen. That's what we're hoping to address.
Well, we tried to convince governments to say, let's fund these type of programs, because what's the cost that's higher? Social welfare through a lifetime, or an educated Native person, who's going to contribute to a society? These arguments are always made. And when we open up our doors here at the university for free tuition, for some of the Indigenous communities in our territory, we get the kickback from other people saying that, why are you doing that for people, giving them free education and stuff like that? I said, that's why we always got to keep letting people know why this is important. I know people who's been on social services their whole lifetime. Add all that up to what you would have paid for their education and what the difference would be. That really makes the difference. And if you got to speak economically, to society, then we already have those arguments ready. And I think the more educated Indigenous people we have with the balance of culture, you got a strong Indigenous nation right there. And we can fight for those treaties even stronger than we do now. Because if we activated those treaties that we all agreed upon, you wouldn't see poverty. You wouldn't see suicidal rates or death rates the way they are, because we would all have the nutrients of what those treaties stood for. Land, we'd have food, we'd have water, have all the things that's necessary. So that's my reason, I think, for stepping away from the political realm, the chief role, because I can fight all day for scraps, or I can implant a new generation with knowledge so that we can start making those changes together. Because when you fight by yourself, they're ready and they already know how to say no. When we got allies and people understood this reason, that they're signatories to the treaties, then you have a democracy telling your government that we need to live up to those. So that's the hope.
Yeah. And, the more I've actually learned about the history of the economy that was booming on this continent long before contact, sophisticated trade networks, there's archaeological evidence showing that quinoa seeds are being traded all the way from Kentucky to Brantford. And there's evidence of flint or obsidian, that volcanic glass, all over North America coming from Yellowstone. And all of those trade networks made Europe very, very wealthy. There was Indigenous entrepreneurs who were making lots of money off the back of the fur trade. And Europe, yes, it was very much helping Europe. But all of that wealth that helped save Europe, all those trade networks existed. They were here. And when you go back and, like I said, just looking at the history, Indigenous folks, when they started raising beef, because the Indigenous folks knew the water and they knew the land so well, they were raising beef faster and cheaper than the colonial settlers were. And on Oneida, I think in your community, they actually made it illegal. The settlers went and complained to the politicians and said, we can't make any money, can't compete with their businesses. You have to shut this down. We're not going to live here. We're not going to settle here if we can't make money. And so they shut it down. They made it illegal for Indigenous folks to sell beef. And, they were not allowed to get involved in the oil and energy and gas, and kept out of computing. And, now we really can't allow the same thing to happen with AI and these other new technologies that are coming along. And I know a lot of Indigenous folks who are very keen to implement some of these new technologies, and good for them. Mm-hmm. And so it's not surprising when you look at how Indigenous folks were kept out of the credit system for about 100 years. It makes perfect sense why these values aren't built into the community. And you see this leakage, 90% of the money being spent off reserve. And that's what we're trying to teach in our incubator, is these values. It's not about customer discovery. It's not about extracting the maximum lifetime value from a customer. It's about co-creating with your community and delivering value. And Indigenous folks, we have our own way of doing business. It's relationship-based, it's reciprocity-based, and it's a little bit different, but it's better. Let's say, your nephew was selling blueberry muffins, and I really like, carrot muffins. I'm on a diet. Well, rather than me going to London and spending the money to get carrot muffins from somebody else and that money leaving, it's better for me to go to that young lad and said, hey, you know what? I'll buy your blueberry muffins, but next time, if you made carrot, I would really appreciate that. Yep. And so it's better to keep that money in the community and working and help develop that entrepreneur than it is to just take the easy way out and go the cheap option.
You know what? During the Indian Act stopping businesses on reserve was everything that grew on the First Nation territory became contraband as soon as it left the reserve. So even to have real businesses like farming industry on reserve became illegal for our people. Everything that was grown, and it was in the law that once it left the reserve, we couldn't sell it. We couldn't give it to anybody because it became contraband. And the extent they went to keep us from creating our own economy and keep us independent on their giveaways and stuff like that was such a, I don't know, when I think about that, it still angers me, to think how much they did that. And I can go on and on with things that took place with our communities, but we're now here and now we understand and now we're educated. So let's make this change, fight for what they agreed upon as signatories to these treaties. And then I think we can expand. So that's just my hope anyway. So where are you going to go with all this now? You're working with the university now in a position and you're going to be doing some traveling all across Canada, I hear.
Yeah, we're hoping to develop this program and offer it through partnership colleges. So Bow Valley College in Calgary, Lethbridge University nearby, and then near Winnipeg and Brandon, Assiniboine Community College, Sault Community College in Sault Ste. Marie, and St. Mary's University in Halifax. So we're hoping to connect Indigenous entrepreneurs and Indigenous leaders is really what we're hoping to connect from across Turtle Island and bring them all into one place and show them that business, we can have the business skills to go into these VC meetings with the best of them, but making sure that we've also incorporated traditional community values and we're making sure that we're building community from the get-go. And we want to get away from this lone wolf, solopreneur attitude that, everyone has to do it alone, because the truth is no one ever does it alone. Mm-hmm. It's a community behind you. And we want to build leaders who can build communities so that Indigenous children 25 years from now, they don't even second guess it why they would want to run a business or get a bank loan. And, they have no fear about credit and they have confidence and generational wealth.
I would suggest, like looking into the States too, because we do have a treaty that Canada doesn't recognize called the Jay Treaty. And the United States does, right? So you can go to the States and work there, but American Indians can't come to Canada because after the War of 1812, they said that treaty was no longer valid. But I would suggest that we try to do that. I'm trying to do that with our friends down in New Orleans right now to create a trade route between us. They have shrimp and they do natural life standards that they do, and we can trade maple syrup. And you just got to break the law sometimes, and you just have to do it and create that. What we always had in the past was trade relationships with other First Nation communities. So that's why I always tell people, think about the state. Let's break that Jay Treaty, broken treaty, from Canada and encourage our nations, because Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee people are both sides of the border and they separate us politically, but they're still our family. So something to think about anyway.
No, I love that you're bringing this up, Myeengun, because people all the time ask me, what is Indigenous entrepreneurship? What is Indigenous business? And they think it's like this new term. And we have to remind them, like, no. It's about getting back to business as usual. Mm-hmm. You're right. Because the shrimp, all of this, it was going across that invisible line. Business as always. And so just getting back to how it used to be, I think, we're not talking about anything that controversial here.
That's right. Anyway, Evan, it was nice. Wow, that went by so quick, and such an interesting conversation. And really thank you for taking the time to come and join Nish Vibes today and being a part of this conversation. I learned a lot, and I've always learned from you. So thanks so much.
Yeah.
Miigwech.